You were just living here, Mom. My son said it like he was commenting on the weather, like it was something simple, factual, harmless. I remember the exact way his fork hovered over his plate, the way he didn't quite look at me when he said it, as if eye contact might make the words heavier than he intended them to be. I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I didn't ask him to repeat it. I just sat there at the dining table I had polished every Sunday for over 30 years, the same table where he used to do his homework, where his father used to read the newspaper every morning, where birthdays and holidays had once meant something. The chandelier above us cast a warm yellow light, the kind that should have made everything feel safe, familiar. Instead, it felt like a spotlight, exposing something I hadn't wanted to see. Rachel sat across from me, her posture straight, her lips pressed into a thin line that almost looked like a smile if you didn't know her well. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The silence between them said enough. It had been 8 days since we buried my husband, Thomas. 8 days since I stood beside a polished wooden casket and listened to people talk about a life that had been mine as much as his. 8 days since I came back to this house expecting grief, expecting quiet, expecting emptiness, but not this. Not this slow, careful way of being erased. I reached for my glass of water, my hand steady even though something inside me had shifted, something small but solid, like a piece of glass settling into place. Pass the salt, Rachel said, her voice light, almost casual, as if nothing unusual had just happened. I slid the shaker across the table without a word. Daniel finally looked at me then, just for a second, and I saw it, hesitation, maybe even a flicker of guilt, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. He cleared his throat. We've been talking, he said, glancing at Rachel before continuing. About the house. Of course they had. I nodded once, inviting him to continue, even though I already felt the direction this conversation was heading. It's a lot to maintain, he added. Too much for one person. One person. The words echoed quietly in my mind. I had been maintaining this house since before he could tie his shoes. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every draft that slipped through the windows in winter, every stubborn cabinet that needed an extra push to close properly. But I didn't say any of that. I just listened. We think it would be better, Rachel said, picking up where he left off, her tone measured and polite in that way that always felt rehearsed, if you found somewhere smaller. Something easier. More appropriate. Appropriate. I folded my napkin neatly beside my plate, aligning the edges carefully, giving myself something to focus on that wasn't the tightness forming in my chest. I see, I said, my voice even. And I did see. More clearly than I had in years. The dinner continued after that, if you could call it that. Plates were cleared. Dishes were rinsed. Rachel talked about renovations, about opening up the kitchen, about turning the guest room into a nursery someday. Daniel nodded along, occasionally adding a comment, occasionally glancing in my direction as if remembering, for a moment, that I was still sitting there. I excused myself before dessert. I said I was tired, which wasn't entirely untrue. Grief has a way of settling into your bones, making every step feel heavier than it should. But this wasn't just grief. This was something colder. Upstairs, the bedroom felt unchanged. Thomas's reading glasses still rested on the nightstand. His favorite sweater was draped over the back of the chair, exactly where he'd left it the night before he died. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking it all in, the quiet, the stillness, the absence that somehow felt louder than anything downstairs. I walked over to the dresser and looked at my reflection. A 71-year-old woman with silver hair and tired eyes stared back at me. But there was something else there now, something new. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter. Something sharper. Downstairs, I could hear Rachel's voice, light and animated, and Daniel's lower, more subdued replies. They were already moving on, already planning, already rearranging a future that no longer seemed to include me. I sat on the edge of the bed and folded my hands in my lap. For years, I had told myself that distance was normal. That children grow up, build their own lives, set their own priorities. I had accepted missed phone calls, shortened visits, holidays that felt more like obligations than celebrations. I had adjusted. I had stayed quiet. But this was different. This wasn't distance. This was replacement. I leaned back slightly, letting my eyes rest on the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the paint that Thomas had always said he would fix one of these days. He never got the chance. And now, it seemed, neither would I. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. You were just living here. The words replayed again, softer this time, almost detached. I thought about the years behind those walls. The nights I stayed up waiting for Daniel to come home as a teenager. The mornings I packed his lunches, drove him to school, sat in the stands at every game, every recital, every event that mattered to him. I thought about the day we signed the papers for this house, how Thomas had squeezed my hand and said, "This is ours." Not his. Not mine. Ours. I opened my eyes and sat up straighter. Downstairs, a cabinet door closed. Footsteps moved across the kitchen floor. Life continued, just as it always does, indifferent to the quiet shifts that change everything. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and held it in my hand for a moment, feeling its weight. There were numbers I hadn't called in years. People I hadn't needed to speak to. Not until now. I didn't dial right away. Instead, I placed the phone back down and stood up, walking slowly to the window. The backyard stretched out behind the house, the same maple tree standing tall near the fence, its leaves just beginning to turn. Thomas had planted that tree the year Daniel was born. "It'll grow with him," he'd said. And it had. I watched the branches sway gently in the evening breeze, steady, rooted, unmoved by anything happening inside these walls. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something settle inside me that wasn't grief. It wasn't sadness. It was clarity. A quiet understanding that something had shifted, and that I could either let it happen to me, or decide what happened next. I turned away from the window, my movements slow but deliberate. Tomorrow, I would make a call. Not to argue. Not to explain. Just to understand. Because if there was one thing Thomas had always taught me, it was this: never sign anything you don't fully read, and never assume you know everything just because someone else says you do. Downstairs, Rachel laughed at something Daniel said, the sound carrying faintly up the stairs. I paused for a moment, listening, then continued across the room, turning off the lamp beside the bed. The room fell into shadow, quiet and still. And in that stillness, I made a decision I didn't need to say out loud. I didn't argue at the table. I didn't defend myself. But the next morning, I would do something they weren't expecting. I woke before the sun came up, the kind of quiet hour that used to belong to Thomas, when he would shuffle into the kitchen in his slippers and start the coffee maker before I even opened my eyes, and for a moment I lay there listening, almost expecting to hear that familiar rhythm, the soft click of the machine, the low hum that meant another ordinary morning was beginning, but there was nothing, just the faint ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside, and I realized again, not with the sharp pain of the first few days but with a dull, steady awareness, that ordinary mornings were gone, replaced by something else entirely, something quieter and far more uncertain. I sat up slowly and reached for the sweater draped over the chair, Thomas's sweater, the one he wore every fall, and I slipped it over my shoulders without thinking, the fabric still holding the faintest trace of his scent, or maybe just my memory of it, and I walked downstairs, each step deliberate, each movement measured, as if I were learning how to exist in this house all over again. The kitchen was exactly as I had left it the night before, clean, orderly, untouched, but it no longer felt like mine in the way it once had. There was a subtle shift, something invisible but unmistakable, like a room that has been rearranged while you were asleep. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, looking out at the backyard where the maple tree stood tall and unchanged, the same tree Thomas had planted decades ago, and I found myself wondering how something could remain so rooted while everything else seemed to move around it. My phone sat on the counter where I had placed it the night before, and I looked at it for a long moment before picking it up, my fingers hovering over the screen as I scrolled through contacts I had not needed in years, names that belonged to a different part of my life, a part where decisions were shared, where questions were answered together, where I never had to wonder what I was entitled to because everything was understood, and then I found it, Howard Blake, the attorney Thomas had worked with for as long as I could remember, the man who had handled contracts, documents, things I had never paid much attention to because Thomas always said it was taken care of. I pressed the call button before I could second-guess myself. The line rang twice before a calm, professional voice answered, and when I introduced myself there was a pause, just a brief one, followed by a softness in his tone that told me he had already heard about Thomas. We exchanged a few quiet words, the kind people say when they do not quite know what else to offer, and then I told him I needed to review everything, not urgently, not dramatically, just carefully, and he agreed without hesitation, suggesting I come by later that morning. I set the phone down and took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth spreading through me in a way that felt grounding, steady, like the first step on solid ground after a long time drifting. Upstairs I could hear movement, the faint sound of footsteps, a door opening, a voice, Rachel's voice, light and brisk as always, followed by Daniel's lower reply, and for a moment I considered going up, saying something, asking a question, but the thought passed just as quickly as it came. There was nothing to ask, not anymore. Everything I needed to understand would not be found in conversations at the breakfast table. I rinsed my cup and set it carefully in the sink, then walked back upstairs, not to engage, not to explain, but to get ready. I chose a simple outfit, something comfortable but presentable, the kind of clothes I had worn countless times for errands, appointments, ordinary days, and yet this did not feel like an ordinary day. There was a quiet sense of purpose in my movements, a clarity that had not been there before. When I came back downstairs, Daniel was in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone, his tie still loose around his collar. Rachel stood near the counter flipping through a stack of papers, and for a moment the scene looked almost normal, almost like any other weekday morning. "You are up early," Daniel said, glancing at me briefly before returning his attention to the screen. "I have an appointment," I replied, my voice steady, neutral. He nodded without asking any further questions, and I realized then that he was no longer expecting answers from me, just as I was no longer expecting understanding from him. Rachel did not look up, did not acknowledge me at all, her focus fixed on whatever plans she was reviewing, and I walked past them without another word, picking up my purse from the chair by the door. The same purse I had carried for years, worn at the edges but still functional, still reliable. Unlike so many other things that had shifted without warning, the air outside was cool, crisp in that early autumn way that always used to feel refreshing, but today it felt different, sharper, more defined. I got into my car and sat there for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as I looked back at the house, the windows reflecting the pale morning light, everything appearing exactly as it always had from the outside, and yet I knew now that appearances could be deceiving. I drove slowly at first, taking the familiar route through streets I had known for decades, passing by the grocery store, the park where Daniel used to play as a child, the small church where we had attended services every Sunday, each place carrying memories that felt both distant and immediate at the same time. And as I drove I found myself thinking not about what had been lost, but about what I had never fully seen, the details Thomas had handled quietly, the decisions he had made without burdening me, the way he had always said, "Everything is in order," with a certainty I had trusted completely. The law office was located in a modest building downtown, nothing extravagant, just a clean, professional space with a small sign by the entrance. I parked and stepped out of the car, smoothing my sweater as I walked toward the door, the weight of the moment settling gently rather than heavily, like something I had been preparing for without realizing it. Inside, the receptionist greeted me with a polite smile and asked me to take a seat, and as I sat there, hands folded in my lap, I felt a calm I had not expected, not because I knew what I would find, but because for the first time since that dinner, I was no longer waiting for someone else to define my place. I was about to find out for myself. I sat in the leather chair across from Howard Blake's desk, my hands folded neatly in my lap, the same way I had sat through countless meetings beside Thomas over the years, except this time there was no reassuring glance from my husband, no quiet squeeze of my hand under the table, just the soft hum of the office air conditioner and the faint rustle of paper as Mr. Blake opened a thick file in front of him. He adjusted his glasses and looked at me with a kind of careful attention that made me realize this was not just another routine appointment. "Mrs. Collins," he said gently, "I am very sorry for your loss." I nodded once, acknowledging the words without letting them pull me backward. I had already spent days sitting in that space between grief and confusion, and now I was here for something else, something clearer. Thank you, I replied, my voice steady. I would like to understand what was left, and what belongs to me. There was no accusation in my tone, no urgency, just a quiet request for facts, for clarity, for something solid I could hold on to. He nodded and turned a few pages, his fingers moving with practiced ease. Your husband was very thorough, he said after a moment. He organized everything well in advance. That sounded like Thomas, always preparing, always thinking a few steps ahead, even when I did not realize it. I am going to walk you through this step by step, he continued, and I want you to stop me at any point if something is unclear. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my eyes focused on the documents in front of him, the neat lines of text, the signatures, the dates, all of it representing decisions made quietly, deliberately, over time. First, he said, there is the primary residence. He paused, glancing at me briefly before continuing. The house is not solely in your son's name, nor was it ever intended to be. I felt something shift inside me, not surprise exactly, but a recognition, like hearing something that had always been true but never spoken out loud. The property, he continued, is held in a trust, established by your husband several years ago. A trust. The words settled into my mind slowly, deliberately. And you, he added, looking directly at me now, are the primary beneficiary and controlling trustee. I did not react immediately. I let the words settle, let them take shape in my understanding before responding. Meaning? I asked calmly. He gave a small, reassuring nod, meaning that you have full authority over the property, including decisions regarding its use, its sale, and who resides there. I looked down at my hands for a moment, noting how still they were, how steady, as if they already understood something my mind was just beginning to process. So my son cannot, I began, then paused, choosing my words carefully, make decisions about the house without me. Mr. Blake closed the folder gently and folded his hands on top of it. That is correct, he said, his tone firm but not dramatic, just factual. He has no legal authority to sell, transfer, or otherwise control the property without your explicit consent. The room felt quieter then, not because anything had changed externally, but because something inside me had aligned, like pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. I thought about the dinner table, about Daniel's voice, about the way he had said those words as if they were unquestionable, as if they were already true. You were just living here, I repeated silently, and for the first time since he said it, the sentence no longer felt like a weight pressing down on me. It felt like something I could examine, something I could set aside. Mr. Blake continued, opening another section of the file. There are also several financial accounts associated with the trust, he explained, savings, investments, and a reserve fund specifically designated for property maintenance and personal expenses. I listened carefully, absorbing each detail, not interrupting, not rushing, just letting the information build, layer by layer. Your husband structured these accounts to ensure that you would not be dependent on anyone else, he added, his voice carrying a note of quiet respect. He was very clear about that. I allowed myself a small breath, not quite relief, but something close to it, something steady and grounding. He always said he would take care of things, I murmured, more to myself than to Mr. Blake. He did, the attorney replied simply. He then reached for a separate document, one that looked slightly different from the others, more detailed, more specific. There is one more element I need to explain, he said, his tone shifting just slightly, not alarmingly, but with a sense of importance. A clause within the trust that addresses beneficiary conduct. I lifted my gaze to meet his, my attention sharpening. What kind of conduct? I asked. He adjusted the paper in front of him, his eyes scanning the text briefly before speaking. Your husband included a provision stating that any individual who attempts to coerce, manipulate, or pressure you into relinquishing control of your assets, or who engages in behavior deemed harmful to your well-being, may forfeit any future claims or benefits associated with the trust. The words were precise, measured, but their meaning was unmistakable. I felt that same quiet shift again. Deeper this time, more defined, not shock, not anger, but clarity, unmistakable and complete. I sat there in silence for a few seconds, letting the full weight of that information settle into place, not as something overwhelming, but as something empowering, something that had been there all along, waiting to be understood. He anticipated complications, I said finally. Mr. Blake gave a small, knowing nod. He anticipated possibilities, he corrected gently, and he wanted to ensure that you would always have both protection and control. I looked down at the document again, the lines of text no longer just abstract legal language, but something purposeful, intentional, something Thomas had put in place not out of fear, but out of foresight. I thought about Daniel, about Rachel, about the conversation I had overheard, the plans, the assumptions, the certainty with which they had already begun to rearrange my life. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to confront it. Immediately, I did not feel the urge to explain, to argue, to correct them. Instead, I felt something much quieter, much stronger. I closed my purse slowly and stood up, smoothing the front of my sweater as I did. "Thank you," I said, meeting Mr. Blake's eyes with a calm that came from understanding rather than emotion. "I would like copies of everything." He nodded, already gathering the documents. "Of course," he replied. As he handed them to me, I took them carefully, not as evidence of conflict, but as confirmation of something I had nearly forgotten, something Thomas had never stopped believing in. I turned toward the door, the papers held securely in my hands, and as I stepped out of the office into the bright midday light, I realized that nothing about the house had changed, nothing about the past week had changed, but I had, and that made all the difference. I drove home more slowly than usual, not because I was unsure of the road but because I was no longer in a hurry to arrive, the envelope of documents resting on the passenger seat beside me like something that had quietly shifted the balance of my world without making a sound. The streets looked the same, the stoplights changed at their usual rhythm, people crossed intersections carrying coffee cups and briefcases, everything moving forward with that steady, predictable motion that life insists on maintaining even when something inside you has changed completely. I kept my hands relaxed on the steering wheel, my posture upright, my breathing even, because for the first time in days I did not feel like I was reacting, I felt like I was choosing. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, sitting there for a moment as the silence settled around me. The house stood exactly as it had that morning, unchanged, familiar, and yet no longer uncertain. I picked up the envelope and stepped out of the car, closing the door with a quiet click that seemed to mark the end of one phase and the beginning of another. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of cleaning products and something sweet, perhaps a candle Rachel had lit, a detail I might have overlooked before but now registered clearly. I set my purse down on the small table by the entryway and walked into the kitchen. Daniel stood near the counter with his laptop open, his sleeves rolled up, his expression focused in that distant way he had developed over the years. Rachel was at the island, flipping through what looked like renovation catalogs, glossy pages filled with images of open floor plans and modern finishes. They both looked up when I entered, not startled, just aware. "You are back," Daniel said, his tone neutral, almost routine, as if I had simply returned from a grocery trip. "Yes," I replied, placing the envelope gently on the counter, not hiding it, not emphasizing it, just setting it down as part of the room. Rachel's eyes flickered toward it for a brief moment before returning to her pages. "We were actually just talking about the kitchen," she said, her voice light, conversational. "There is a contractor who can come by next week to take measurements." I nodded once, acknowledging her words without engaging with them, not because I did not hear her, but because I no longer needed to respond to everything that was said. I moved past them and filled a glass of water, the simple act grounding me in the moment. Daniel closed his laptop halfway, his attention shifting more fully toward me now. "Did you find what you needed?" he asked, and there was something in his voice, not concern exactly, but curiosity, a quiet expectation that I might share details, explain my movements, justify my morning. I took a sip of water before answering, letting the pause exist without rushing to fill it. "I found clarity," I said finally, my tone calm, measured, neither confrontational nor dismissive, just factual. He nodded slowly, as if processing the response, while Rachel set her catalog down and crossed her arms lightly. "Well, that is good," she said, offering a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes, "because we really should start making decisions soon. These things take time." I set the glass down on the counter and turned slightly to face them both, not with tension, not with urgency, just with presence. "Yes," I said, "they do." There was a brief silence, the kind that used to make me uncomfortable, the kind that would have pushed me to smooth things over, to fill the space with reassurance or agreement. But this time I let it remain. I let it stretch just long enough for them to feel it too. Daniel shifted his weight, glancing at Rachel before speaking again. "We were thinking it might be best if you started looking at places this week," he said, his voice steady but softer than before. "There are some nice communities not too far from here, places with less upkeep." I looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, at the way he avoided holding my gaze for more than a second at a time, at the subtle tension in his posture, and I realized something that might have hurt me before but now simply felt clear. He had already decided what my life should look like, and he had done so without asking me. I reached for the envelope and opened it carefully, sliding a single document out and placing it flat on the counter between us, not dramatically, not as a challenge, just as a fact introduced into the room. I spoke with Mr. Blake, I said, my voice even. He helped me review everything Thomas arranged. Rachel's posture stiffened slightly, her attention sharpening, while Daniel leaned forward just enough to glance at the paper. Without fully committing to it, and? Rachel prompted, her tone still light but edged with something more focused. I met her gaze calmly. And I will not be going anywhere, I said, not loudly, not forcefully, just clearly. The words settled into the space between us with a quiet finality. Daniel's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough for me to see the moment his expectation collided with something he had not anticipated. Mom, he began, his voice carrying a note of caution, we are just trying to make things easier for you. I nodded slightly, acknowledging the phrasing, the intention behind the words, or at least the version of intention he believed in. I understand what you are trying to do, I replied, but this house is not a decision for you to make. Rachel's lips pressed together, her composure tightening as she stepped closer to the counter, her eyes scanning the document more carefully now. What does that mean? She asked, her voice controlled but no longer casual. I slid the paper an inch closer to them, giving them a better view without pushing it into their hands. It means, I said, that the house is held in a trust, and I am the one who controls it. The words were simple, direct, stripped of any unnecessary explanation. Daniel straightened slightly, his brow furrowing as he processed the information. That does not make sense, he said after a moment. Dad would have. He stopped himself, the sentence unfinished, the assumption behind it left hanging in the air. I did not interrupt. I did not correct him immediately. I let him sit with it. Rachel reached for the document then, her fingers moving quickly as she scanned the lines, her expression shifting from skepticism to something more focused, more calculating. There must be some mistake, she said, her voice sharper now. We have already spoken to a realtor. I looked at her calmly. Then you should speak to them again, I replied, because no sale can happen without my approval. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier, more defined. Daniel looked from the paper to me and back again, his earlier certainty replaced by something less stable, less assured, and I could see it clearly now, the moment when control began to slip, not because I raised my voice, not because I argued, but because I no longer accepted the version of reality they had created. I picked up the remaining documents and placed them back into the envelope, my movements unhurried, deliberate. I will be in my room, I said, not as a retreat, but as a statement of direction. I turned and walked toward the stairs, aware of their eyes on me, aware of the shift that had taken place without a single raised voice, and as I reached the top step, I paused briefly, not to look back, not to say anything more, but simply to acknowledge to myself that something had changed, not in the house, not in the walls or the rooms or the furniture, but in the way I stood within it, and that change was not something they could undo. I did not go back downstairs right away after that conversation. Instead I closed the bedroom door behind me and sat at the edge of the bed, the envelope still resting in my hands, not clutched tightly but held with a quiet awareness of what it represented. I could still hear faint movement below, a cabinet opening, a drawer sliding shut, Rachel's voice low and controlled, Daniel responding in short, uncertain phrases, and I knew without needing to listen closely that the conversation had shifted, that the certainty they had carried into that kitchen had been replaced by something else, something less comfortable. I set the envelope on the nightstand beside Thomas's reading glasses and leaned back slightly, letting my eyes rest on the ceiling, tracing the same faint lines in the paint I had noticed the night before, and for the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself to think not about what I had lost, but about what I had overlooked. Thomas had never been careless, not with our home, not with our finances, not with the future. He had always been deliberate, steady, and I realized now that what I had taken for simplicity was actually structure, something built quietly over time, something that did not need to be explained because it was meant to protect. I stood up after a few minutes and walked to the dresser, opening the top drawer where I kept old photographs and documents, things I had not needed to look at in years. I found a small stack of papers Thomas had once shown me briefly, things he said were important but not urgent, things he told me not to worry about. and I remembered now the way he had said it, not dismissively, but gently, as if he knew I would only need to understand them if something changed. I closed the drawer and turned back toward the door, my movement steady, deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant. When I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the house felt different again. Not unfamiliar, but more clearly defined, like a place I could see without distortion for the first time in years. I walked downstairs slowly, each step quiet but certain, and when I reached the kitchen, Daniel and Rachel were still there, standing closer together now, their conversation stopping the moment I entered. Rachel's posture was tighter than before, her arms crossed, her expression composed but no longer relaxed. Daniel looked at me with a mixture of confusion and something else, something that might have been concern if it had not been layered with uncertainty. "Mom," he said, his voice lower now, more careful, "we need to talk about this." I nodded once, not inviting, not resisting, just acknowledging, and I walked to the counter, setting the envelope down again in the same place as before, not as a gesture of confrontation, but as a constant presence in the room, something they could not ignore even if they tried. "There is nothing unclear," I said calmly, my tone even, "but if you have questions, you can ask them." Rachel stepped forward slightly, her eyes fixed on me now, no longer glancing away, no longer pretending this was a casual conversation. "We already made plans," she said, her voice controlled but firm. "We spoke to a realtor. We started looking at contractors. We have been organizing everything based on the assumption that this house would be ours to manage." I listened without interrupting, letting her finish, letting every word settle into the space between us, and when she was done, I nodded again, not in agreement, but in recognition. "That was your assumption," I said simply. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I had seen countless times when he was trying to make sense of something that did not fit into his expectations. "Dad would have told me if that was the case," he said, his voice carrying a note of frustration now. "He would not have left me out of something like this." I met his gaze steadily, not challenging, not softening, just present. "Your father made sure I was not left out," I replied, the words quiet but clear. Rachel shook her head slightly, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the tension underneath. "This does not change the reality," she said. "You cannot manage a house like this on your own. It is not practical." I reached for my glass of water again, taking a slow sip before responding, not to delay, but to maintain the pace I had chosen, the calm that now felt natural rather than forced. "Practicality is not the issue," I said, setting the glass down carefully. "Authority is." The word lingered in the air, heavier than anything else that had been said. Daniel's expression tightened, his shoulders shifting as if he was preparing to argue, but he stopped himself, the uncertainty still present, still unresolved. Rachel looked at the envelope again, then back at me, her eyes sharper now, more focused. "We should have a professional review this," she said. "Someone independent." I gave a small nod. "You are welcome to do that," I replied, "but the documents will not change." The certainty in my voice did not come from defiance. It came from understanding, and that difference seemed to unsettle them more than any raised voice could have. There was a pause, longer this time, filled not with discomfort but with recalculation. I could see it in the way Rachel's posture adjusted, in the way Daniel's gaze shifted between me and the papers, in the way the room itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. I did not fill that space. I did not rush to resolve it. Instead, I reached for my purse and picked it up from the chair, slipping it over my shoulder with a smooth, familiar motion. "I will be out for a while," I said, not as an explanation, but as a statement of fact. Daniel frowned slightly. "Where are you going?" he asked, the question automatic, almost reflexive. I looked at him for a moment, considering the answer, not because I needed his approval, but because I wanted to be precise. "To take care of a few things," I said, my tone neutral. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to determine what that meant, what actions might follow, what control might be slipping further out of reach. I did not elaborate. I did not offer details, because for the first time in a long time, I understood that not every decision needed to be explained. I walked toward the door, my steps steady, unhurried, and as I reached for the handle, I paused briefly, not turning around, not adding anything more, just allowing the moment to settle. Then I stepped outside into the afternoon light, closing the door behind me with the same quiet click as before. And as I walked to my car, I realized that this was no longer about reacting to what they said or did. It was about what I would do next, and that was something they had not yet begun to understand. I did not drive far at first. I let the car move slowly through the neighborhood, past houses that looked almost identical to mine, each one holding its own version of quiet routines and unseen tensions, and I realized how easy it was to assume stability just by looking at something from the outside. I stopped at a red light and rested my hands lightly on the steering wheel, my reflection faintly visible in the windshield, steady, composed, unchanged on the surface, and yet everything beneath that surface had shifted into place with a clarity I had not felt in years. I turned toward the bank instead of continuing down the main road, not because I was uncertain, but because I knew exactly what needed to be done next. The building stood tall and familiar, a place I had visited many times with Thomas, though I had rarely needed to speak during those visits. He had always handled the conversations, the details, the decisions, and I had trusted him completely. Now I stepped inside on my own, the cool air and quiet professionalism of the space wrapping around me like something structured and predictable, something I could rely on. A young woman at the front desk greeted me with a polite smile and asked how she could help. I gave my name and explained that I needed to review accounts connected to a trust under my name. Her expression shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition of the seriousness of the request. She nodded and asked me to wait for a specialist. I took a seat near the window, watching as people moved in and out of the building, each one carrying their own concerns, their own priorities, and for a moment I thought about how many of them believed they understood their lives completely, how many of them were standing on structures they had never fully examined. After a few minutes a man in his 50s approached me, introducing himself as Mr. Carter, his manner calm and professional. He led me into a private office and closed the door gently behind us. "Mrs. Collins," he said, taking a seat across from me, "how can I assist you today?" I placed the documents from Mr. Blake on the desk in front of him, not hurried, not hesitant, just presenting them as part of a process I now understood. "I would like to confirm access and control over all accounts connected to this trust," I said, my voice even. He nodded and began reviewing the papers carefully, his eyes moving steadily across each page, occasionally typing something into his computer, the quiet tapping of the keyboard filling the room. I sat back and waited, not anxious, not impatient, just allowing the process to unfold. After a few minutes he looked up, his expression respectful, slightly more attentive than before. "Everything appears to be in order," he said. "You are listed as the sole controlling trustee with full authority." I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the confirmation. "I would like to ensure that no transactions can be made without my direct approval," I added. He nodded again, already turning back to his screen. "We can place additional verification requirements on all accounts," he explained. "No withdrawals, transfers, or changes will be processed without your authorization, either in person or through secured confirmation." I watched as he worked, the methodical nature of his actions reinforcing what I had already begun to understand, that control was not something abstract, it was something defined, documented, enforced. "Please proceed," I said simply. He continued typing, then printed a few forms and slid them across the desk toward me. "I will need your signature here, here, and here," he said, pointing to each line. I picked up the pen and signed my name carefully, each letter deliberate, each stroke steady, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I understood now what those signatures represented. When I finished, he gathered the documents and nodded once more. "Everything is secured," he said. "No one else will be able to access or alter these accounts without your direct involvement." I allowed myself a small breath, not relief exactly, but confirmation, something solid, something complete. I gathered my copies and placed them back into my envelope. Then stood, smoothing my sweater out of habit more than necessity. "Thank you," I said, meeting his gaze briefly. He smiled politely. "Of course, Mrs. Collins. If you need anything further, please do not hesitate to contact us." I left the office and walked back through the bank, the quiet hum of activity continuing around me, unchanged, and when I stepped outside, the afternoon light felt sharper, clearer, as if the world itself had come into focus. I returned to my car and sat for a moment before starting the engine, not because I was unsure of where to go next, but because I wanted to recognize the moment for what it was, a transition not marked by noise or conflict, but by quiet, deliberate action. I drove back home with the same steady pace, the envelope once again resting beside me, but this time it felt different, not just a collection of documents, but a structure I had stepped into, a position I had fully claimed. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Daniel's car still there, Rachel's as well, their presence unchanged, their expectations likely shifting with each passing hour. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, my posture straight, my movements unhurried, and when I entered the house, the air felt the same as before, but I did not. I set my purse down and walked into the living room. where Daniel stood near the window, his phone in his hand, his expression tense. Rachel sat on the couch, her posture rigid, both of them turning toward me as I entered. "We called the realtor," Daniel said immediately, his voice tight. "They said there is an issue with the listing." I met his gaze calmly. "Yes," I replied, setting the envelope down on the table. "There is." Rachel leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on me. "What did you do?" she asked, not loudly, but with a controlled intensity that revealed more than any raised voice could have. I did not answer right away. I let the silence settle, not as a tactic, but as a reflection of the new pace I had chosen, the new space I occupied. Then I spoke, my voice steady, clear. "I made sure that nothing connected to this house or its accounts can be changed without me." Daniel stared at me for a moment, the weight of that statement sinking in, reshaping the assumptions he had been holding on to. Rachel's expression tightened further, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the frustration underneath. "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be," she said. I held her gaze, not with challenge, not with anger, just with clarity. "No," I replied, "I am making it accurate." The room fell quiet again, but this time it was not uncertainty that filled it. It was recognition, the slow realization that the position they thought I occupied no longer existed. And as I stood there, not raising my voice, not taking a step forward or back, I understood that this was no longer about convincing them of anything. It was about allowing them to see what was already true. Daniel did not speak right away after that, and for the first time since all of this began, I saw something unfamiliar in his expression, not anger, not certainty, but hesitation, as if the ground beneath him had shifted just enough to make him question where he was standing. Rachel, however, did not hesitate. She stood up from the couch and walked toward the table where the envelope rested, her movements controlled but sharper now, more deliberate. "This is not how things work," she said, her voice firm, her eyes fixed on me with a kind of focused intensity that had always been there, just never directed at me so openly. I remained where I was, my posture relaxed, my hands resting lightly at my sides, not defensive, not confrontational, simply present. "It is exactly how things work," I replied, my tone even. Daniel exhaled slowly and set his phone down, stepping forward as if trying to bridge something that had already widened beyond his reach. "Mom, we are not trying to take anything from you," he said, his voice softer now, almost careful. "We just thought it made sense for us to handle things, make decisions together." I looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, and I realized that he believed that version of the story, or at least needed to believe it. "You did not ask me," I said quietly, and the simplicity of that sentence seemed to land heavier than anything else I could have said. Rachel crossed her arms again, her composure tightening as she shifted her weight slightly. "We did not think we needed to," she replied, and there it was, not hidden, not softened, just stated plainly. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "That is clear," I said. The room fell into silence again, but this time it was not uncertain. It was defined, shaped by what had already been revealed. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck, a habit from years ago, a sign that he was trying to find a way through something he did not fully understand. "So what now?" he asked, his voice quieter, less certain. I turned slightly toward the window, glancing out at the backyard where the maple tree stood unchanged, steady, rooted. Then I looked back at him. "Now," I said, "things stay as they are." Rachel let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, something sharper. "That is not realistic," she said. "You cannot expect everything to just stop because you suddenly decided to take control." I held her gaze, not with challenge, not with emotion, just with clarity. "I did not suddenly decide anything," I replied. "I understood what was already mine." Daniel's eyes shifted between us, the tension in the room building in a way that did not need raised voices to be felt. "We already invested time into this," he said. "We talked to people, we started planning. We cannot just undo all of that." I listened, letting his words settle, recognizing the frustration beneath them, the sense of effort that now felt wasted, but I also recognized something else, something more important. "You can," I said simply. Rachel shook her head again, her patience thinning. "You are being difficult," she said. I tilted my head slightly, considering the statement, not reacting to it, just examining it. "No," I replied, "I am being accurate." The word hung in the air again, steady, immovable. Daniel sat down on the edge of the chair, his posture no longer upright and assured, but slightly collapsed, as if the weight of the situation had begun to settle on him. "There has to be a way to work this out," he said, more to himself than to me. I stepped closer to the table and placed my hand lightly on the envelope, not gripping it, just resting it there, a quiet anchor in the conversation. There is, I said, my voice calm. You adjust your plans. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly, her expression sharpening as she processed the implication. And if we do not, she asked, her tone controlled but edged with challenge. I met her gaze steadily. Then nothing changes, I replied. The simplicity of the answer seemed to frustrate her more than any argument could have. She turned away for a moment, pacing a few steps before stopping again, her mind clearly working through possibilities, alternatives, ways to regain the position she believed she had. Daniel looked up at me, his expression now carrying something closer to recognition, not full understanding, but the beginning of it. You already took steps, he said slowly, with the bank, with the documents. I nodded once. Yes, I said. He let out a breath, longer this time, as if accepting something he had been resisting. Rachel turned back toward us, her posture straightening, her composure returning in a different form, not relaxed, but calculated. We should get our own lawyer, she said, her voice steady again. Have everything reviewed independently. I gave a small nod. You can, I replied, but the structure will not change. She held my gaze for a moment longer, as if trying to find a weakness, a hesitation, something she could use to shift the balance back in her favor, but there was nothing there for her to find. Not because I was stronger than her, but because I was no longer uncertain. The room settled into a quiet stillness again, but this time it felt final, not temporary, not waiting for resolution, but acknowledging that the resolution had already begun. Daniel stood slowly, his movements less certain than before. I need some time to think, he said. I inclined my head slightly. Of course, I replied. Rachel did not say anything. She simply turned and walked toward the hallway, her steps controlled but firm, as if she needed movement to contain the tension she was holding. Daniel lingered for a moment, looking at me as if he wanted to say something more, something that might bridge the distance that had formed, but the words did not come, and after a few seconds, he turned and followed her, leaving me standing in the quiet of the living room, the envelope still beneath my hand, the house unchanged around me, and yet everything within it now clearly defined. I moved to the window once more, looking out at the backyard, the same tree, the same light, the same stillness, and I realized that this was no longer about what they would do next. It was about what they now understood, and that understanding, once it settled, would change everything whether they accepted it or not. The house remained quiet that evening in a way it had not been before, not the heavy silence of grief, not the awkward stillness of avoidance, but something more deliberate, as if every room was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I moved through the space slowly, turning on a lamp in the living room, straightening a cushion that did not need straightening. Small actions that grounded me in the present moment without pulling me back into the past. Upstairs I could hear faint movement, the soft closing of a door, the low murmur of voices that stopped whenever footsteps approached the hallway. They were speaking. Of course they were, recalculating, adjusting, trying to find a version of this situation that still placed them in control. I did not interrupt. I did not go upstairs. I let them have that space because it no longer threatened me. Instead I walked into the kitchen and prepared a simple dinner for myself. Nothing elaborate, just something warm, something steady, the kind of meal I had made countless times before. And as I stood at the stove, I realized how different this moment felt compared to just a few nights ago. There was no tension in my hands, no hesitation in my movements, just a quiet sense of order. I carried my plate to the table and sat down in the same chair I had always used, the same view of the room, the same light above me, and yet the weight of that seat had changed. I was no longer sitting there as someone waiting to be included. I was sitting there as someone who understood her place completely. Halfway through my meal, Daniel came downstairs, his steps slower than usual, his posture less certain. He paused at the entrance to the dining area as if unsure whether to approach or retreat. Then he walked in and sat across from me without saying anything at first. I continued eating, not ignoring him, but not rushing to fill the silence either. After a few moments, he spoke. We spoke to an attorney, he said, his voice careful. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without reacting. And? I asked, setting my fork down gently. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I could see it clearly now. The shift that had begun earlier had settled deeper. He said the documents appear valid. He admitted, the words coming out slower than he might have intended, as if each one carried more weight than he expected. I held his gaze, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, just with quiet recognition. Yes, I said. He exhaled and leaned back slightly, his shoulders lowering as if Something inside him had finally given way. "We did not know," he added, and this time there was something in his voice that had not been there before, something closer to honesty than justification. I inclined my head slightly. "I believe that," I replied, "because I did. I believed that he had not known, but I also understood that not knowing had not stopped him from acting, from deciding, from assuming." Rachel remained upstairs, her presence felt but not seen, and I could sense the distance in that absence, not just physical, but strategic. She was not ready to re-enter the conversation without a new angle, a new approach. Daniel rested his hands on the table, his fingers interlaced, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond me. "We thought we were helping," he said quietly. I let the words sit between us for a moment before responding. "You thought you were deciding," I said, not harshly, not accusingly, just precisely. He nodded slowly, accepting the distinction without argument. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, it was reflective, a space where something real could exist without being forced into a resolution. After a few minutes, he looked up again. "What happens now?" he asked, the same question as before, but this time it carried a different weight, not expectation, not resistance, but genuine uncertainty. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate before answering, maintaining the same calm, deliberate pace that had guided me since that morning. "Now," I said, "you adjust." He let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it, just a recognition of how simple and how difficult that statement was at the same time. "And if we want to stay?" he asked, choosing his words carefully. I met his gaze steadily. "Then you stay as guests," I replied, the words clear, unambiguous, not unkind, but firm. He nodded again, slower this time, absorbing the meaning fully. Upstairs, a door opened, and Rachel's footsteps followed, measured, controlled. She entered the dining area with her posture straight and her expression composed. But there was something different now, something more restrained, more cautious. "We need to set boundaries," she said, her tone even, but no longer authoritative. I looked at her calmly. "Yes." I agreed. She paused, just briefly, as if recalibrating her approach. "Then we should discuss terms," she continued. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap. "We can," I said, "but understand this first." I let the pause exist, not for effect, but to ensure the words that followed would land clearly. "Nothing about this house or its assets will be decided without me." Rachel held my gaze for a moment, searching, measuring, and then she gave a small, controlled nod, not agreement, not acceptance, but acknowledgement. Daniel remained quiet, watching the exchange, his role shifting from participant to observer as he processed the new structure forming around him. The room settled into a different kind of silence then, not uncertain, not tense, but structured, defined by what had already been established. I stood slowly, gathering my plate and carrying it to the sink, the simple act grounding me once more in the rhythm of the house. I rinsed the dish and set it aside, then turned back toward them, not to continue the conversation, not to push further, but simply to exist within the space I now fully understood. And as I looked at them, at the subtle shifts in their posture, in their expressions, in the way they occupied the room, I realized that the balance had already changed, not through force, not through argument, but through clarity, and that clarity would continue to shape everything that came next. The next morning arrived without announcement, just a quiet shift in light through the curtains and the soft ticking of the clock that had always marked the start of another ordinary day. But nothing about this felt ordinary anymore. I woke before the house stirred, the same way I had the day before, but this time there was no hesitation, no lingering uncertainty about what needed to be done. I dressed slowly, deliberately, choosing a simple blouse and the same cardigan I had worn the previous day, not out of habit but out of intention, a quiet consistency that matched the steady clarity I now carried. When I stepped into the hallway, the house was still, the silence no longer heavy but structured, like a space that had settled into its new shape. I moved downstairs and into the kitchen, preparing coffee with the same measured movements, the familiar routine now anchored in something stronger than memory. I sat at the table and waited, not for them, not for anything specific, but simply allowing the morning to unfold. After a few minutes, Rachel came downstairs, her posture composed, her expression carefully neutral. She paused briefly when she saw me, then continued into the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee without speaking. Daniel followed shortly after, his movements slower, his eyes briefly meeting mine before he looked away. There was no greeting, no attempt to return to the version of normal that had existed before, and that absence felt more honest than any forced conversation could have been. I took a sip of my coffee and set the cup down gently, breaking the silence not with tension but with intention. "We will meet with Mr. Blake this afternoon," I said, my voice calm, steady. Both of them looked at me then, not startled, but attentive, Rachel's eyes narrowing slightly as she processed the statement, Daniel straightening just enough to show that he understood the significance. "Why?" Rachel asked, her tone controlled but direct. I met her gaze evenly. "Because there is a clause you need to hear from him, not from me," I replied. Daniel frowned slightly, confusion crossing his face. "What clause?" he asked. I did not answer immediately. I let the pause exist, not to create tension, but to allow the weight of the moment to settle. "You will understand when it is explained properly," I said. Rachel set her cup down a little harder than necessary, the sound sharp against the quiet of the room. "We already had someone review the documents," she said. "We know what they say." I nodded once, acknowledging her confidence without challenging it. "Then this will confirm it," I replied. Daniel glanced at Rachel, then back at me, the hesitation still present but now mixed with something else. Something closer to caution. "What time?" he asked. 2:00, I said simply. The rest of the morning passed without further discussion, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered would be addressed later. I spent the time in small, deliberate actions, organizing papers, making a few phone calls, not hurried, not secretive, just steady. Rachel remained distant, her movements precise, her conversations limited to Daniel and carried out in low tones. Daniel, however, moved differently, slower, more aware, as if he was beginning to understand that the ground beneath him had changed in a way he could not ignore. When the time came, we left the house together, the drive quiet, not tense, not filled with arguments, just a shared awareness that something significant was about to be clarified. Mr. Blake greeted us with the same calm professionalism as before, his expression neutral but attentive as he led us into his office. We sat in the same positions, the same arrangement, but the dynamic had shifted, no longer unspoken, no longer assumed. "Thank you for coming," he said, looking at each of us in turn. I nodded slightly. "Please explain the conduct clause," I said, my tone steady, direct. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her attention focused, Daniel sitting back but clearly listening. Mr. Blake opened the file and adjusted his glasses. His voice measured as he began. "The trust includes a provision designed to protect Mrs. Collins from undue pressure or coercion," he said, his words precise, his tone neutral. "Any individual who attempts to influence her decisions through manipulation, intimidation, or persistent pressure may be subject to disqualification from any future benefits associated with the trust." The room became still, not dramatically, but completely. Rachel's expression did not change immediately, but her posture did, a slight tightening, a subtle shift that revealed the impact of the words. Daniel blinked once, slowly, as if processing something that had not fully registered before. "What does that mean in practical terms?" Rachel asked, her voice controlled but sharper now. Mr. Blake closed the file gently and folded his hands. "It means that if such behavior is documented or demonstrated, the individual in question can be legally removed as a beneficiary," he replied. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his earlier hesitation now replaced by a more focused concern. "Removed?" he repeated. Mr. Blake nodded. "Yes, entirely." The silence that followed was different from the ones before, not uncertain, not reflective, but conclusive. Rachel sat back slowly, her gaze shifting briefly before returning to the table. Daniel remained still, his expression no longer confused, no longer searching, but understanding. I did not speak, I did not need to. The words had been said, the structure had been clarified, and for the first time since that dinner, everything was no longer based on assumption, but on fact. We left the office without argument, without raised voices, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had been made clear. The drive home was even quieter than before, not tense, not filled with unspoken questions, but settled, as if the outcome had already begun to take shape. When we arrived, Daniel stayed in the car for a moment before stepping out. Rachel walked ahead without looking back, and I followed at my own pace, not leading, not trailing, simply moving forward. And as I stepped inside the house, I realized that nothing needed to be said now, because everything that mattered had already been understood.